He only wanted a cup of coffee. No cameras, no confrontation, just a quiet morning before his first day as a restaurant owner. But when Marcus handed over his cash, the manager looked at him like he'd handed her garbage. Then, she did something no one in that room would ever forget, something that turned a simple purchase into a public humiliation. What she didn't know was that the man she just disrespected held her entire career in his hands. If she'd known who he really was, maybe she would have thought twice. But by then, it was already too late. For Marcus Thompson, mornings were sacred. Calm, predictable moments before the chaos of boardrooms and contracts. He'd built a success quietly, the kind that didn't need to be flaunted. A man who came from nothing, who once washed dishes in the back of restaurants just like the one he now owned. Today was supposed to be different, a milestone. The ink on the acquisition papers was barely dry, and he decided to start his first day not as the new owner, but as a customer. He wanted to see how people were treated when no titles, no suits, no prestige announced their worth. So he dressed simply, blending in. Just another man looking for breakfast and a little kindness. The restaurant buzzed with morning chatter, unaware that the person they were about to judge held the power to change everything. If only they'd look a little closer, at his calm eyes, at the quiet confidence beneath the simplicity, they might have noticed who they were really serving. But what happened next would expose far more than bad manners. It would reveal something much darker. The bell above the door chimed as Marcus stepped into the cafe, the aroma of roasted beans and syrupy pastries wrapping around him. The manager, Rachel Morrison, looked up from the counter, a smile forming, then vanishing just as quickly when her eyes landed on him. Her tone shifted instantly, that clipped politeness reserved for people she'd already decided didn't belong. Marcus approached the counter with quiet patience, offering a polite nod as he placed his order. Rachel's gaze lingered on his worn jacket, his simple watch, his neatly folded bills. When he handed her the cash, she didn't take it. She pinched it between her fingers like it might stain her. Then, with a flick of her wrist, she dropped the change straight into the trash. "We maintain standards here," she said under her breath, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. Conversation stopped. Forks froze midair. A few customers exchanged uncomfortable glances. Others pretended not to see. Marcus stood perfectly still, his calm almost unnatural. The humiliation burned quietly inside him, not from the money, but from the message. You don't belong here. Rachel wiped her hands like she'd touched something dirty, turning to the next customer, a white businessman dressed almost identically to Marcus. Suddenly, her voice was bright, professional, dripping with charm. "Good morning, sir. What can I get started for you today?" The shift was instant, deliberate, and devastatingly clear. Marcus watched her serve the man with a ceramic mug and a warm smile, while his own coffee sat on the counter in a flimsy paper cup. A young woman in the corner, Zoe Carter, started recording on her phone, whispering, "Y'all seeing this?" Rachel noticed and snapped, "No filming in here." Her voice carried the sharpness of someone used to control, to power, but the phone didn't lower. The whispers grew louder. Marcus could feel the eyes on him, not empathy yet, just curiosity, like a scene unfolding in slow motion. He wanted to walk away, to let her drown in her own arrogance. But something deeper anchored him, a lifetime of moments like this, brushed off and buried. "Not this time. I'd like to speak to your manager," he said calmly. Rachel laughed, brittle and sharp. "You're looking at her." The arrogance in her tone sent a ripple through the room. The businessman glanced up briefly, guilt flickering his eyes before he looked away. Marcus stayed silent, steady. His calm unnerved her more than anger would have. She called for security, her voice trembling just enough to sound like a victim's. Joe, the security guard, appeared, a heavy-set man whose eyes went straight to Marcus. "Sir, you need to leave." The words hung like a verdict. Marcus didn't move. "For standing quietly?" he asked. Rachel crossed her arms. "For making people uncomfortable." Her words carried a twisted irony that settled heavy in the air. Joe took a step forward. Phones lifted higher. The tension was electric, almost suffocating. Somewhere in the back, a digital countdown glowed red, a health inspection timer Rachel had clearly forgotten about. Her job, her image, her fragile sense of superiority. Everything was beginning to crack. Zoe's live stream comments rolled fast. This is racism. Someone called corporate. He didn't even do anything. The truth was spreading faster than Rachel could control. The power she'd used so carelessly was slipping through her fingers, and she didn't even see it. Marcus adjusted his leather portfolio, calm as ever. Inside it sat the papers that would change everything, the very ones that made him the rightful owner of the restaurant she was so desperate to defend. But for now, he said nothing. He just watched, waited, let her bury herself in her own performance. Around him, the crowd grew restless. The sound of sirens began to wail faintly in the distance. And for the first time, Rachel's mask faltered. Her voice cracked, her hands trembled, but her pride wouldn't let her stop. "Security! Call the police," she ordered. The words left her mouth before she realized they'd sealed her fate. Marcus didn't flinch. He only smiled faintly, a gesture of someone who already knew how this story would end. If Rachel thought humiliation was the worst thing waiting for her, she hadn't seen what was coming next. The sirens grew louder until red and blue lights washed across the cafe's polished windows. Rachel stood behind the counter, trying to keep her composure as Marcus remained motionless, calm in the storm she had created. Security guard Joe's hand hovered near his radio, voice low but urgent, describing Marcus as aggressive. The word hung heavy, dangerous, distorted, and familiar. The crowd held its breath as Officer Rodriguez stepped inside, her presence commanding instant silence. "What's going on here?" she demanded. Rachel jumped in first, her words tumbling fast, frantic. "This man's been harassing staff, refusing to leave." Rodriguez's gaze shifted to Marcus, who simply opened his portfolio. The zipper's metallic sound sliced through the air. Inside, pristine documents gleamed under the fluorescent lights. "You're calling the police?" Marcus said evenly, "on the man who owns this establishment." He placed a crisp business card on the counter. The gold lettering caught the light. Marcus Thompson, CEO, Thompson Hospitality Solutions. The cafe erupted in whispers. Rachel's face drained of color, her confidence collapsing in on itself. "That's impossible," she stammered, reaching for the card with trembling hands. Marcus withdrew a second document, the finalized acquisition contract stamped and signed that very morning. The officer examined it, her expression shifting from suspicion to stunned realization. "He's telling the truth," she said flatly. The weight of those words shattered the illusion Rachel had built around her authority. Cameras caught everything, the lies, the reversal, the reckoning. Zoe's live stream comment count skyrocketed. He owns the place. Justice in real time. Rachel's breath came in shallow gasps, panic flashing in her eyes. The businessman from earlier lowered his phone, shame written across his face. The power dynamic flipped so suddenly that the air felt charged, electric. Marcus didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You threw my money in the trash," he said softly, "and tried to throw me out with it." Each word landed like a hammer, deliberate and calm. Rachel's defenses crumbled. The officer turned toward her, arms crossed. "Ma'am, I suggest you stay quiet." Behind her, the health inspector reappeared, clipboard in hand, announcing 14 major violations, each one a nail in the coffin of Rachel's career. The tension was unbearable, yet no one looked away. Marcus glanced toward Zoe, giving her a small nod, permission to keep filming. The truth was finally being witnessed, and there was no script Rachel could hide behind now. Her voice cracked, tears pooling in her eyes as she whispered, "Please, I didn't know." But ignorance had never been an excuse. It was a weapon she'd wielded so easily until the moment it turned on her. Marcus didn't respond. He simply stepped back, letting the truth speak louder than revenge ever could. The officer turned off her radio, no longer treating Marcus as a suspect, but as someone who just exposed a deeper sickness, one that couldn't be solved by arrests or apologies. Rachel's entire world had been flipped, her power dismantled, her prejudice laid bare before the very people she'd once looked down on. Marcus looked around the room. The same faces that had watched in silence earlier now stood frozen, realizing what they'd been complicit in. And for a long, breathless moment, the cafe was silent. No sound but the hum of the air conditioner and the soft buzz of Zoe's phone streaming justice to thousands of viewers across the world. But the story wasn't over, not yet, because what Marcus did next would change everything. Rachel stood motionless as reality sank in. The restaurant she ruled with arrogance now belonged to a man she just tried to humiliate. The officer's words still echoed in her ears. He's telling the truth. Around her, the crowd began to shift, some ashamed, some stunned, all realizing they'd just witnessed something they couldn't unsee. Marcus didn't gloat. He didn't demand apologies. He simply gathered his documents, calm as ever, and looked around the room that had once watched him with quiet judgment. "We'll be making some changes," he said softly, his voice steady but heavy with meaning. A week later, Rachel's name was gone from the employee roster. Zoe's live stream had reached over 3 million views, sparking debates on news networks, social media feeds, and morning talk shows. People were angry, not just at Rachel, but at what she represented. The reflexive prejudice that infects even the most ordinary spaces. Marcus never sought revenge. Instead, he offered something far more powerful: accountability. Under his ownership, the restaurant reopened with new policies, new training, and a culture built on dignity. Maria, the server who once stayed silent, became the new assistant manager. The same community that had witnessed cruelty now saw transformation taking root. Yet for Marcus, victory didn't erase the sting of that moment when his worth had been dismissed with a flick of the wrist. It lingered, a reminder that for many, respect still depends on appearance, not humanity. He knew this wasn't just a story. It was a story of every person who's ever been judged before being known, silenced before being heard. As he stood in the doorway of his newly reclaimed restaurant, he glanced at the empty counter where it all began. The hum of morning chatter returned, but the air felt different, heavier, wiser, awake. In a world still battling the ghost of its own bias, Marcus's quiet defiance became more than a personal triumph. It became a mirror reflecting how easily dignity could be discarded and how powerfully it could be reclaimed. Because sometimes justice doesn't roar, it walks in quietly, holding receipts. The question isn't whether racism still exists. The question is, when will we stop pretending not to see it?